Hello again, everybody. Today we are continuing on with Chapter 6 on the changes that were going on in Kansas in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Today we're going to be talking about the early reform movements. Now, lots going on this slide. We have activists working for women's voting rights, a lady holding an axe, which we'll get to her here in a little bit, and then a political cartoon dealing with alcoholism. All that ties into today's lesson. So let's go ahead and get started. For starters, what is reform? Reform is making changes to solve problems and to help make things better. And Kansas served as a leader in reform movements in the entire United States. Just like Kansas was a big part of leading up to the start of the Civil War, Kansas was big in the reform movement as well. But William Allen White, a famous Kansan, he was the editor of the Emporia Gazette newspaper. He once wrote, "When anything is going to happen in this country, it happens first in Kansas." And based on what we've learned so far, he actually did have a point with his statement. First up was Prohibition. Alcohol abuse was a huge concern during the Gilded Age that we talked about with Lesson 1. Bars and saloons were not considered places for proper men and women. They were seen as places that took men away from their families, and some believed that drinking was a sin and should be totally banned altogether. It was thought to make Americans better workers and eliminate violence, overall just make us a better society. Women started groups in favor of prohibition. Prohibition is just the effort to end the use, production, and sale of alcohol. So women were trying to end alcohol use. So the fight for prohibition, there were groups fighting for prohibition, and they advocated temperance. Temperance is the complete avoidance of alcoholic beverages. These groups wanted Kansas to become what was called a dry state, where alcohol wasn't allowed at all. This movement started during territorial days, way back before we even became a state, when the territorial legislature left the issue up to local governments. This led to women smashing a saloon in Lawrence. In the mid-1870s, John St. John, a prohibitionist, someone who is totally against alcohol, was elected our governor. He spoke against the sale and making of alcohol in his inauguration address. And inauguration address, that's a speech that's given by a person when they formally take office. So our governor has an inauguration address. The president has an inaugural address when they take office. That's just what it means. The legislature passed a resolution calling for an amendment to prohibit alcohol. It passed with the voters, and Kansas became the very first state to outlaw the making and sale of alcohol. St. John ran for president eventually, but he didn't win. Even though Kansas had voted to prohibit alcohol, it was not a dry state. It was, but not officially. This was a very difficult law to enforce. The amendment allowed the sale of alcohol for medicinal purposes, and many people saw this as a loophole and they took advantage of it. Many continued to make and use alcohol in their homes, and saloons continued to operate as well. Temperance organizations continued to lobby for stronger laws and enforcement of the existing law. Lobby is just trying to influence lawmakers to take a specific action, and in this case, they were lobbying against alcoholism. On the very first slide, the lady with the axe, that was Carrie A. Nation. And she was a very well-known prohibitionist in Kansas. She was from Medicine Lodge, Kansas. She was a lecturer. She went around and spoke against tobacco and alcohol. And she decided to enforce the prohibition laws herself. The laws weren't doing any good, so she decided she would take matters into her own hands. But she had worked with poor and imprisoned people, and she believed that alcohol robbed a man of his money and led to a life of crime. So she began a career of smashing saloons with her hatchet, as well as bricks and stones. Story is that her husband was an alcoholic, and she saw what it did to her relationship and her family in general, and that's why she fought so hard against it. Another vocab word that is in here, bootlegging. Uh, this was going on a lot during this time period in Kansas. It was just the making, selling, or transporting of illegal alcohol. People who were making and selling and transporting it illegally. Another reform that was going on was women's suffrage. Suffrage is just the right to vote, and at this time, only men had the right to vote, women did not. So Kansas blazed a trail for women's rights during territorial times, back before we became a state. Women were able to gain property rights, and they had the right to vote in school district elections. However, women did not still have full suffrage, suffrage where they would be allowed to vote in state and national elections. A movement tried to convince Kansas male voters to ratify an amendment to give the Kansas Constitution, make an amendment to the Constitution to allow women's suffrage, but it failed. Municipal suffrage. Since state and national suffrage wasn't happening, reformers focused on municipal suffrage, and this was the right to vote in city elections. It was a start. After 2 years, a bill passed, and Kansas became the very first state to give women the right to vote in municipal elections. The legislature decided to ban electioneering to help, which is just a way to help a candidate or political party win an election. But electioneering wasn't allowed within 100 feet of polls. This is a law that's still in effect today. So if you were to be campaigning for a specific candidate, you cannot be within 100 feet of where people vote. And kind of a fun fact, Susanna Salter, she was elected the first female mayor in U.S. history, and she was actually from Kansas, Argonia, Kansas to be exact. Kansas politics changed forever, as well as United States politics. But men placed Susanna Salter's name on the ballot just as a joke, thinking that she wouldn't win. The joke was on them. She won 2/3 of the vote and became mayor. Kind of a woohoo, way to go, girls' rights type of thing. Suffrage for all women. 8 years after women won the right to vote, the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution gave full voting rights to women across the country. It was ratified in 1920, so more girl power there. And we will leave it there. We'll pick up again with more reform and in the way of political parties when we meet again. Have a great day, everybody.